Okay, we're continuing with Chapter 15 of The Ultimate Evil by Maury. Buckle up, guys, it's going to be a long one. Inside the biggest case, John Plankster, commander of detectives for the NYPD's 7th area in the Bronx, was a man held in high esteem by the cops who worked under him. At 50, Plankster was respected for his professionalism, his fairness, and his confidence in the men and women whom he'd broken many an important case over the years. When he was promoted to deputy inspector in 1985, he tossed his own party at a Bronx restaurant and invited about 150 of his former and current detectives, picking up the tab himself. On August 31st, as Sidoti prepared to board the flight to Minot, and the lean, soft-spoken captain, whose reddish hair showed hints of gray, sent a report to Deputy Chief Edwin Dreher, commander of all Bronx detectives. It was titled Confidential Investigation Interim Report Number 1. Plankster summed up the allegation against Rockman, and then he knew Plankster summed up the allegations against Rockman as he then knew them to be, and mentioned that police officials in Minot had advised Sinodi by telephone that Rockman had been in North Dakota with John Carr. Plankster wrote, "It appears that we will be able to draw an association with Rockman, Berkowitz, and Carr. This would raise the possibility that Berkowitz did not act independently or operate alone as originally believed. I fully realize the implications and ramifications of this report, and I also understand the need for discretion in this matter. However, I do believe that we must pursue this investigation to the point where we have eliminated the elements of conjecture." Dreher, who knew Plankster was a first-rate investigator, approved the request, and the Son of Sam investigation reopened by the New York City Police Department. There was, of course, no public announcement, and even within the ranks, only a handful of people knew what was going on. For a long time, I'd envisioned champagne corks popping if I was ever able to get the case reopened. The impossible had been accomplished, the perseverance rewarded. But there would be no celebrations. Instead, I found myself sworn to secrecy. Dreher and his supporters, particularly Chief of Detectives James Sullivan, had not been amused by the Moskowitz investigation we published in July, and Dreher probably wasn't overjoyed that Plankster also attached our March conspiracy article to his report. But Dreher knew he had no choice but to act. Serious questions about Berkowitz's alleged sole responsibility were being raised publicly for the first time. Neither Dreher nor Plankster knew that the person most responsible for those articles was at the moment en route to Minot to interview witnesses. Hank Sinodi had made his own choice, a decision many would disagree with. He had gauged the police department's reactions to the press butting into the sacrosanct 44 case and decided the information he'd gleaned was more important than the source of it, the antagonistic media. For a similar reason, he also protected Veronica Lucan's identity, listing her as a confidential informant. He believed, correctly, that the mention of Lucan's name would sink the ship before it left the pier. Some NYPD officials have stated that Sinodi would have fared better had he laid all his cards on the table. No one will ever know. For my part and Reeve Rockman were mainly the NYPD's responsibility. I was long wary of Lucan, but there was no doubt Rockman was identified by Carr's friends in Minot. But what was his role? Was he an active conspirator and cult member, or was his part that of a well-heeled white-collar dope dealer? As the NYPD was focusing on Rockman, I left the question unanswered and devoted myself to a deeper probe of Michael Carr and the events surrounding John Carr's death. The reconstruction of the scene and events immediately preceding John Carr's death strongly suggested he was murdered. The position of the body and that of the gun were prominent factors, but there were others. For instance, Carr's actions on February 15th, the day before he died, were decidedly not of those of a man contemplating suicide. He rented a postal box, opened a checking account at a local bank, and visited the Air Force to ensure continuing payment of a disability check he was receiving because of a service-connected injury. He took each of these steps within 24 hours after returning from New York, where he'd told Linda O'Connor the police were hot on his trail. Next, on the night of his death, February 16th, he received a phone call at Linda O'Connor's home before she went out for the evening, but he didn't reveal the identity of the 8 p.m. caller to her. When Linda returned at about 12:30 a.m., she saw that her 2 Irish setter dogs were outside the house. They should have been inside. She also said that a latch lock on the inside of the front door had been turned to open it. An unnecessary action. John Carr, Linda said, knew the door could be opened from the inside without turning the latch. Linda also said that Carr was in good spirits before she'd left, and that he told her he would wash the dinner dishes, but the dishes were left half done in the sink, as if Carr was interrupted while washing them. The daily newspaper was also missing from the home, and she reported finding a single glove, neither hers nor Carr's, in the residence. Linda further stated that she borrowed some money from Carr's wallet, leaving several bills in it, yet the wallet was empty when Gardner went through it. For years, Carr had worn a good luck charm he'd acquired overseas, a rubbing Buddha, which was on a chain around his neck, but this artifact wasn't on the body and was missing from the house, as was a picture of his daughter Carr kept in his wallet. Linda O'Connor also said that she found a spot of blood under a living room table the next morning. Gardner, however, said he knew no such blood when he examined the premises the night before. The rifle itself contained no fingerprints, not even smudges. It was as if it had been wiped clean. At my request, Dr. Louis Rowe, the deputy medical examiner of Westchester County, examined the Carr autopsy report. Rowe's testimony would be instrumental in the conviction of Gene Harris for the murder of Scarsdale diet doctor Herman Tarowner. On the basis of the powder burns on Carr's inner mouth and palate as described in the autopsy report, Rowe said, he believed the gun had been inserted deeper in the mouth than normally would occur in a suicide of this type. Combined, these elements pointed to murder. Rowe's opinion supported Sinodi's and my evaluation of the case, which held that an unconscious and semi-conscious Carr was propped up and the gun forced into his mouth. Linda O'Connor would tell a friend she believed Carr was silenced because he knew too much. Berkowitz himself would label him the weakest link because of his drug and alcohol problems. The photos taken of the death scene were merely snapshots, but examining them through a magnifying glass, I noticed several intriguing clues which escaped the attention of North Dakota investigators. I brought the pictures of Captain Gary Buckout of the Greenburgh Police Department in Westchester County. Buckout and Donald Singer, Greenburgh's chief of police, had been aiding in the investigation because the possible connection of several sniper incidents which occurred in their jurisdiction. Buckout handed the photos to Greenburgh's police laboratory, where enlargements were made. As I suspected, the results were startling. First, the blow-ups clearly showed smudges of blood on the bedroom wall. On top of those smudges, which were caused by someone bumping into the wall, were other splatters, angled to the right. These blood splatters were caused by rifle shot, which ended Carr's life. In other words, the blood smudges on the wall preceded the splatters from the head wound. This would have been impossible in a suicide. Second, on the baseboard of the wall, at floor level next to the body, someone apparently attempted to write a message in blood. The letters weren't clear enough to be conclusively deciphered, but there appeared to be several illegible letters followed by NYSS. This, we believed, may have represented New York Son of Sam, but we weren't sure. Buckout, Singer, Sinodi, and later officials in the Queen's DA's office all agreed that some form of writing was evident on the baseboard. Even Gardner reluctantly added his assent. These two developments led to the belief that Carr may have been knocked out in the living room, which would have accounted for the blood Linda O'Connor said she saw there. Then he could have been dragged semi-conscious into the bedroom and thrown to the floor, bouncing off the wall and leaving the first blood smudges on it. A loaded shotgun in the bedroom closet was bypassed, and the .30-30 Marlin rifle next to it in a box was chosen instead, perhaps because a rifle was less likely to shower a killer or killers with blood than would a shotgun blast, but that wasn't certain. Regardless, the rifle ammunition was stored in another part of the house. That is, if Carr was murdered, his killers would have left the bedroom to locate that ammunition. While alone, the semi-conscious Carr, bleeding on the floor, could have tried to leave a message in blood, probably about the identity or origin of the killers, on the baseboard next to where he lay. Then the killers would have returned to the bedroom, propped Carr up, put the rifle butt on the floor and its barrel into his mouth, and set the fatal shot. The box which contained the rifle was on the bed, indicating the gun was located on the spot. But there was more. The photographic enlargements also showed that two small numbers, perhaps a half-inch in height, were scraped into the drying blood on Carr's right hand. They were sixes. A third number 6 was obliterated except for a faint trace, but it too was apparently a 6, for together the numbers would read 666. The sign of the biblical great beast of Revelation, the mark of the devil. There was no other conceivable significance to the numbers. It simply wasn't credible that Carr could have scraped those numbers into his own drying blood, or that he would have. Once again, the authorities who viewed the blow-ups agreed that the numbers were indeed visible, and since they were scratched out of blood, they were erased when the body was washed prior to autopsy. The photographic evidence from the death scene was all that remained. It was now evident, based on all the circumstances surrounding his death, that John Carr was murdered. There was no doubt in the minds of any of the professionals involved that Carr was killed, and that the slaying was motivated by his connection to the Son of Sam case. The murder determination in New York reflected the feelings of Linda O'Connor, Tom Taylor, and other Carr friends who maintained that Carr, despite his problems, wasn't suicidal. Since Carr was murdered, who did it? He had expressed fear of Reeve Rockman, but from all indications, Rockman wasn't the killer type, at least not personally. But could he or someone else have sent the killers from New York or elsewhere to eliminate Carr, who had become an object of police interest? Yes. But it was also possible that someone from North Dakota did the job. Someone Carr knew. Someone he would have allowed into the house. Someone with whom Carr spoke on the telephone at 8 o'clock that night. Someone who would have known from that conversation that Linda O'Connor was leaving for the evening. As far as could be determined, not many people knew Carr had flown back to Minot, so the murderers would have learned his whereabouts from one of the few who did know where he was, or from Carr himself. Terry Gardner would later say that he believed an outsider committed the murder with the help of a North Dakota accomplice. I share Gardner's opinion, but these are informed judgments, not facts. But it is apparent that the murder made to look like a suicide was intended to halt the Son of Sam investigation right there, 6 months after Berkowitz's arrest. The idea would have been to convince the police that if a 44 conspiracy existed, it was limited to Berkowitz and John Carr. The result, case closed. When New York analysis of the nature of Carr's death was relayed to Gardner, he perfunctorily advised his superiors. The conclusion didn't come as a total surprise, since the case was originally labeled a homicide and Gardner and others in Ward County Sheriff's Department already knew a motive for murder existed. But considerable time elapsed since the incident and no real suspects were identified. There was little the sheriff's department could do. If Carr's killer was to be found, it would be New York that would come across him during the Son of Sam investigation. If that happened, Ward County could actively join the probe again, and that was that. For a time, New York officials weren't even convinced that Carr was dead. The body was too disfigured for visual identification, and at least 3 sets of fingerprints sheriff's investigators Glenn Geitzen said he obtained from the corpse were missing. When the Queen's DA's office later requested proof that Carr was dead, there were no fingerprints available. Additionally, the autopsy report itself raised some troubling questions. For instance, the body was listed as being 5 feet 9 inches tall, 2 inches shorter than Carr's height. Estimates of Carr's weight varied widely, some far removed from the corpse's 170 pounds. The corpse's stomach was empty, whereas Linda O'Connor said John had consumed a light dinner. There was no sign of lung damage in the corpse, although Carr had been a heavy smoker of both cigarettes and marijuana for years. Likewise, chemical tests revealed no trace of drugs in the body's system, although Carr at least was taking the powerful tranquilizer Haldol in the days preceding his health. They tried offering me that shit when I went to the ER. No, thank you. And just as puzzling was the fact that the autopsy report failed to note that Carr's left ring finger was scarred as a result of a military accident. It was possible the defect was simply overlooked, but because of the blood on the hands, the photos we enlarged didn't reveal any scarring either. Most curious, however, was the autopsy's report's specific notation that the body was distinctively suntanned, but only between the upper thighs and knees, such as might be seen with the wearing of shorts and high socks. In the first place, the death occurred in North Dakota in February. Before that, Carr was in New York's cold weather. He was in Houston around Christmas of 1977, but that was 2 months before his death. And as the autopsy noted, the tan was restricted to the portion of the body between the knees and the upper thighs. John Carr's friends said he wasn't the type to wear knee socks and shorts in any weather, let alone in a cold climate in the middle of winter. These mysteries would remain. Later, 1 set of fingerprints was located and the FBI matched them to those known to be John Carr's. The discovery didn't settle all the doubts. He could have mailed them in, for all we know, Queens Assistant District Attorney Herb Leifer would say later. He almost certainly is dead, but it remains a small nagging doubt. It's remotely possible he pulled a body switch and cleared out. If the body wasn't Carr's, what kind of person would be apt to suntan in such a manner? Possible answers included hikers, backpackers, forest rangers, or military personnel who were recently in the tropics. My own opinion is that Carr is dead, but like Leifer, I retain a lingering doubt. Carr's body has not been exhumed, and dental records weren't checked by North Dakota authorities. And so stands the case of John Carr. While the Carr analysis was going on in mid-September 1979, Terry Gardner called from North Dakota to report that Michael Carr had become aware of the Minot trip. Linda O'Connor had phoned him with the news. She didn't think she was doing anything wrong, Gardner said. She told him we were checking up on John, and that only a few general questions were asked about him. "That's just great," I replied. "The cops know about him, but they're working on Rockman first. Now Michael has plenty of time to cover his tail. We're going to be cagey. He isn't a fool. He's going to be cagey. He isn't a fool. Just watch your butt," Gardner advised. There's no reason to be concerned about Michael Carr. The probe had appreciably raised his suspect stock, and we would soon learn even more about the enigmatic other son of Sam Carr. The knowledge would cement his position as a prime suspect and answer a question about Berkowitz that plagued me for years. The information came from a source close to Berkowitz, and the details were essentially confirmed. He reported that David's all-important entry into the world of killer cults came about in an undramatic, mundane manner. Already at least somewhat familiar with occult precepts since his acknowledged conversations with his stepmother's daughter, the nomadic witch Anne Berkowitz was lounging outside his Barnes Avenue apartment building in the Bronx one evening in mid-1975 when darkest destiny materialized. Its name, the source stated, was Michael Carr. Berkowitz, as a superintendent, James Lynch verified, would frequently just hang out in front on nice nights. Michael Carr was attending a party in a certain apartment in the building when he, too, decided to enjoy the evening air. On the sidewalk, the source continued, Michael and Berkowitz struck up a casual conversation which gradually crossed into areas of spiritualism. Michael, born in 1952, was a year older than David. He had light brown curly hair styled into a perm. He had a number of drug and alcohol-related problems, as did his brother, and later became an active in the Church of Scientology. No fledgling follower, Michael rose to a mid-level position in the church, but he was also interested in other spiritual matters too, such as the occult and devil worship. It's an old but insightful parable, which advises that when a person is starving, he will accept bread from whoever there is to offer it. In Berkowitz's case, the source stated the slices popped from the toaster that night. Berkowitz, already hurt from the recent reunion with his natural mother, listened eagerly as Michael Carr chatted about such topics as reincarnation, God, Satan, and mysticism. Michael then invited his new acquaintance to join him and others at a party inside, which the source described as a floating coven party. Symbolically, the .44 Bulldog was put into Berkowitz's hands that night. For a long time, I'd looked for the rhyme and reason behind Berkowitz's moves from the Bronx to New Rochelle, and finally out of the way, Pine Street in Yonkers. But when I learned of his sidewalk meeting with Michael Carr, the zigzag wanderings took on a rational meaning. Michael Carr lived 200 yards behind 35 Pine Street. Unknown to the source, Berkowitz had labeled Michael a devil worshipper at Marcy. We had another important confirmation, and now the suspect knew we were asking about him in North Dakota. Meanwhile, Jim Midigar was disappointed that an agreement to withhold publicizing the NYPD's new investigation was struck. Once more, he felt that decisions were being made without his input, and he also was isolated from the Minot officials and sources. In another move, he replaced Felix Gilroy with Ed Rappaport, a prominent criminal attorney. So, at his trial, which was slated to begin in November, I called Gilroy to express my regrets, but he was nonplussed. New word I never heard before. But he was nonplussed about the situation. We just disagreed on how to present the defense. That's all, he said. Just keep going and let me know what happens. Remember, Marcy, I signed off. You got it. We learned a lot that day. In late September, Sinodi and I met for an update at the Westchester home of Joe Basteri, who retired from the NYPD in 1978 after a 30-year career. Bastary was a homicide detective for 20 years and an original chosen member of the Son of Sam task force. He and Hank worked some cases together in the past and remained friendly. Both Sinodi and I wanted to discuss the current inquiry with him. Bastary also spoke by phone with Gardner and Knoop in Minot. It looks good to me, he said after a 2-hour briefing, but you can't do anything about John Carr now. The police department will never admit it. For what? They'll let the dead dogs lie. You've got to go ahead with Michael Carr and Rockman, and you need something concrete from Berkowitz to bust this wide open. That stuff he said about Marcy was good, but you want him to give you more than that. I know, I said, but John Carr is still important. We can't just say we've got him connected to the biggest case in NYPD history when no one else is supposed to be involved, and let it go at that. I didn't mean you should forget him, Bastary explained. That's the way the department will look at it. They don't want to know about this stuff. There are bodies all over the goddamn streets, and all they care about is their image, I said. No, Bastary said. You can't blame the whole department for this. The task force didn't know all the details. Everything went upstairs. Whatever went down on this case involved the brass and Eugene Gold. I have no bitch with the task force guys or the rest of the NYPD. I replied, just with those people who knew and did nothing about it. Bastary was torn by the new developments. He was staunchly loyal to the NYPD, but at the same time he recognized the Son of Sam case was far... He noticed the Son of Sam case was far from settled. The meeting with Bastary marked the beginning of what we'd later jokingly called the Pine Street Irregularities, a takeoff on Sherlock Holmes' vagabond Baker Street Irregulars. In time, a group of current and retired police officers would occasionally convene at one of our homes to compare data and discuss avenues of investigation in the case. All involved were interested in seeing the true story of the killings exposed. Their assistance would be invaluable. Included in the group, whose membership varied from time to time, were Bastary and Sinodi, Yonkers Lieutenant Michael Novotny, Greenberg, Captain Gary Buckout, Yonkers arson investigator Don Starkey, and myself. Chief Don Singer of Greenberg also provided support, as we did several other officers, including FBI agents for whom anonymity is necessary. Eventually, Ted Gunderson, a retired senior special agent in charge for the FBI, would join the effort from his private investigation agency in Los Angeles. Gardner, Knoop, and reporters Jeff Neese and Jack Graham remained in contact from Minot. We've got our own informal Omega task force, Buckout once observed. That may have been so, but one of its charter members was nearly lost at 11:15 p.m. on September 24th. Terry Gardner, on a routine stop in his unmarked sheriff's car, slowed to a halt at a trailer dealership on US 83 outside of Minot. As he did, a shot rang out and a bullet whizzed over the roof of his car, leaving a hole in the wall of a building behind him. Gardner jumped out, dove under his auto, and lay in silence for several minutes. There was no additional gunfire. A nearby witness said he observed two men acting suspiciously in the area investigators determined the shots came from, and it was believed a blue and white car was used in the getaway. The Ward County Police speculated that Gardner, who cruised the lot nightly, may have happened upon teenagers siphoning gasoline. No arrests were made. I learned of the incident from Jeff Neese, who told me the article would appear in the following day's Minot Daily News. Later, Gardner phoned and confessed that the attempt rattled him considerably. Why? I asked. Would kids snatching gas be carrying guns and fire at a cop who didn't even see them? And when's the last time someone shot at a cop out there? A long time ago, Gardner said. I don't know what the hell this was all about, but you can keep your thrill. I don't know what this is all about, but you can keep your thrill-a-minute investigations back there. Burglars don't usually shoot at people, I said. They're more apt to run if spotted. And you didn't even see them. No, I didn't. But I do go by there every night, usually within a half hour of the same time, but no more. There was no way of knowing for certain if the attack on Gardner was connected to the ongoing 44 investigation in Minot. We had strong suspicions, but that's all they were. Nonetheless, I called Sinodi immediately and relayed the information to him. It's probably related, I said. Whatever you and your people are still safe and sound in your secret investigation while someone out on the front lines is getting shot at. I don't like this, Hank replied. Damn right. It's our work they're doing out there, and they're getting no help from you guys. If this one didn't involve Sam, the next one might. I'll take care of it, Sinodi said, and passed on the details to his superiors. The detective was alarmed, and I was apprehensive too. Not a week before, Gardner had cautioned me because Michael Carr had learned of our visit to Minot. Now someone had taken a shot at Gardner. Our flanks were decidedly unprotected. 2 days later, the NYPD reacted by veering from the Rockman Road when Detective Captain John Plankster interviewed Mrs. Florence Larson at the 50th Precinct in the Bronx. Larson was the animal placement worker who received a call from someone identifying himself as Berkowitz seeking a German Shepherd just 2 days before his arrest. I learned of Plankster's questioning because Larson called me as soon as she returned home. Larson said that Plankster showed her a copy of the March article in which I'd quoted her and asked if the story was accurate. He had me read it, and I told him it was true, she said. He told me we're going to investigate this article and all the information that's in it, point by point. I certainly hope so, Florence, I answered. Larson said that Plankster took down all sorts of information about me and my family and call about the shepherd. Larson said that Plankster took down all sorts of information about me and my family. The call about the shepherd and dead shepherds in Yonkers and other people involved in the case that I knew, he had me repeat my whole part in the case. He said that you Gannett newspapers were stirring up a lot of trouble and that he'd just been assigned to the case and that he'd be getting back to me again. In his next report to Dreher, dated October 1st, Plankster wrote that Mrs. Larson remained firm about the details of the telephone call from Berkowitz, and apparently has no reason or motive to fabricate this incident. The telephone call is significant because persons associated with John Carr in Minot, North Dakota, have been reported to use German Shepherds in connection with rituals and sacrifices. We have a copy of a taxidermist bill dated August 9, 1977, for the mounting of a dog ear. In terms of publishing, the lions were still at bay. The Gannett, Westchester, Rockland papers and the Minot Daily News were aware of what was occurring, but agreed to delay publicizing the NYPD's new investigation to honor the arrangement. Jeff Neese and I had made with Sinodi. Some will certainly say the news should have been made public immediately, that Neese and I were becoming part of the story rather than simply observers of it, as some believe the press should only be. An Associated Press reporter said, "People want to know if you're a reporter or a detective." "A little of both," I answered, "and within those boundaries I believe any investigative journalist should feel confident of my decisions he or she might make. Uncovering the news, conducting investigations, is not the same as chronicling the news, and in the 44 case my role fluctuated between both poles. I thought it was in the best interests of the overall investigation to withhold certain developments from publication until an appropriate time. My position was never one of news management or interference with the public's right to know. But from the singular perspective one gains when inside a particular probe, I believe it's beneficial to avoid premature disclosures which could compromise the opportunity for success. I was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the hold agreement after Gardner became a target. Jim Midigar was pressing for full disclosure, and the Plankster interview of Mrs. Larson added more fuel to the fire. I told Sinodi that as more principals in the case were questioned, the likelihood of leaks to other media branches increased. At the same time, in Minot, Sheriff's investigator Glenn Geitzen was angered that he wasn't consulted during our trip to his jurisdiction. We met the sheriff, and we were with Gardner, so what's Geitzen's problem? I asked Nice. He says he should have been informed and that he thinks Carr committed suicide and he's ticked off badly. That's between him and Gardner and Sheriff Schwann. Gardner said Geitzen didn't give a damn after a week of interviews following the Carr's death and said it was a New York's problem. Gardner and Knoop did most of the work, so Geitzens opened a vineyard full of sour grapes. He didn't even inventory all of the Carr's possessions before sending them to the Eugene Gold Crematorium in Brooklyn. He's the last one to bitch about anything. Okay, Jeff said, but he might go to a TV or radio reporter out here and let it out that the investigation's going on. Wonderful, I answered, and got off the phone. Ward County politics was about to become the least of our worries. At 4 a.m. on October 4th, Michael Vale Carr III, a prime suspect, was racing toward a rendezvous with infinity. As he sped north on Manhattan's rickety ancient West Side Highway at 70th Street, something happened. His pale green Buick plowed headlong into a street-like stanchion at nearly 75 miles per hour. The impact dislodged the steering wheel and ripped the engine out of the car. At 27, Michael Carr was finished. Dave Hartley of the Yonkers Herald-Statement called me at 8:30 a.m. I've got a photographer down there now. Maybe the pictures will tell us something. Why, Dave? I asked. Aren't we sure that this is merely a coincidence? Actually, I was dazed by the news. Too many coincidences, Hartley replied. Hank Sinodi was on the scene by 10 a.m. He reported no skid marks indicating Carr never hit the brakes, but said he saw a small crease which appeared fresh on the car's rear passenger side fender. It was there, Hank stated. Whether or not he got it just then, I can't say, but it wasn't there long. Wheat Carr, Michael's sister, said she talked to him after 10 and before 1 that night. She said he was going into Manhattan to meet a friend and relax and party. Wheat also remarked that Michael had worked since 7 o'clock in the morning in the Yonkers home. That may somehow have been so, but a receipt found in the demolished auto showed that it had been parked for 8 hours that day, until 6 p.m. October 3rd, at Cousin's Garage at 58th Street in Manhattan. I left the lot at 6:03, 10 hours before Carr's death. What actually happened to Michael Carr may never be known. Both his sister and Linda O'Connor in Minot said he wasn't a fast driver, yet the car was traveling at a very high rate of speed on a section of decaying cobblestoned roadway that required considerable caution. Carr, who was a frequent visitor to Manhattan, knew the highway's contours well. Wheat Carr maintained that Michael, as a member of the Church of Scientology at 10th Street and 6th Avenue in Greenwich Village, hadn't touched alcohol in 3 years, yet his blood alcohol was reported to be 0.15, and a reading of .10 is considered intoxicated under New York state law. Did Michael Carr violate his Scientology credo, or did someone spike his favored orange juice drink? Or was he chased and then forced off the road? Or did someone shoot out a tire or tamper with his car in some other manner? Or did Michael Carr, who knew for the past 3 weeks that he was under scrutiny in the Son of Sam case, commit suicide? Or was it only a curiously timed accident? One thing was bluntly clear. Both real-life Sons of Sam and named by Berkowitz as cult members were now dead, and both died violently within weeks of their names being handed to authorities as suspects in the 44 case. Dave Hartley was right. There were too many coincidences. Wheat Carr initially said that she believed Michael's death had nothing to do with the Berkowitz investigation, but Yonkers Lieutenant Mike Novotny stated that she later approached law enforcement officials in both Manhattan and saw Westchester in an attempt. Well, I gotta reread that. Novotny stated that she later approached the law enforcement officials in both Manhattan and Westchester in an attempt to have his demise probed as a murder. Meanwhile, just where Michael Carr spent his final hours remained a mystery. Michael Carr was educated in Yonkers schools and graduated from the Rochester Institute of Technology and Photography in upstate New York in 1973. Reportedly married for a brief period, he earned his living as a photographer and graphics illustrator, in addition to duties with the family's answering service business. Michael liked to bounce around the glittery Manhattan disco circuit. He counted among his friends a number of professional photographers, and sources close to Berkowitz state that Michael also socialized with the kinky homosexual set uptown near Columbia University and elsewhere downtown. Both at work and play, Michael occasionally wore high boots and an earring, according to an attorney whose name is known to Queens investigators. A Westchester Tavern employee whose name is also known to investigators stated that at about 1:30 a.m. on October 16, 1976, he threw David Berkowitz, Michael Carr, and a companion named Bobby out of a favorite car watering hole in Greenburgh. The Candlelit Inn at 519 Central Avenue. The employee knew Michael Carr and said he likewise recognized Berkowitz and Bobby. Shortly after the rowdy trio were shown the exhibit, 2 shots snuffed the candlelight. One hit the front of the building and embedded in the wall, but the other crashed inside and wounding a young woman in the ankle. Not satisfied, the unknown snipers pegged 2 more shots into an office building at nearby 455 Central Avenue. We would consider this incident when analyzing other sniper attacks in Westchester, several of which were mentioned earlier. One of those, which involved the wounding of a young girl, happened within a mile of the Candlelight Inn. The Candlelight endured a few hard times. Witnesses said a woman connected to the Son of Sam investigation once shot out the tavern's clock. The ballistics report from the Candlelight at 455 Central Avenue incident stipulated that all the bullets were fired from a revolver, possibly of a Smith & Wesson manufacture, either a .38 Special or a .357 Magnum. The following handguns were registered to other members of the Carr household at the time of Michael Carr's death: 2 Smith & Wesson .357 Magnums, 2 Colt .38s, a Smith & Wesson .32, a Bauer .25, a Colt .25, and a Colt .22. Besides his candlelight capers, Michael Carr had the insidious inclination of obtaining credit cards under fraudulent names. Some scented it with illusions of royalty. For instance, this upstanding Scientology counselor held charge cards from both Gimbel's department stores and European health spas in the name of Baron de Zarnkowski. At J.C. Penney, he registered as M.V. Zarnkowski, and at Bloomingdale's he purchased his fragrances under the moniker M. Dekarnowski. Michael Carr fancied himself an exiled Russian nobleman, even to the point of creating his own coat of arms. When I saw his Baron credit listings and also noticed the word Tsar was hidden in two of his last names, I was reasonably certain that another of the Breslin letter aliases was deciphered, the Duke of Death. I suspected the remaining alias, the Wicker King Wicker, belonged to a certain other party. We already knew who John Wheaties was, and we believed the 22 disciples of hell referred to the cult itself. Regarding Michael Carr's pronounced Russian interests and the information that he associated with people at Columbia University, it is interesting to note that Son of Sam victim Virginia Valkerichain was herself a Russian language student at Columbia and was even dating her 27-year-old Russian instructor at the time of her death. It is also known that the killers, after being observed in the neighborhood for quite some time before the attack, shot Virginia, who was late on what was her regular homeward route from Columbia. The link may or may not be substantive, but it has never been checked by any law enforcement agency. The shock waves generated by Michael Carr's death jolted everyone involved in the investigation. In Minot, the word spread like wildfire among John Carr's associates after Gardner and Knoop phoned several of them with the report. In New York, my own phone rang all day. Tom Bartley, Dave Hartley, and Joe Ungaro of Gannett wanted to release the story of the NYPD's investigation as soon as possible. Midigar and now Jeff Neese chimed in. Sinodi, Gardner, and Knoop pleaded patience. Don't do anything now. There's going to be surveillance at the wake, Sinodi explained. Despite that request, I was leaning toward publication. More importantly, so was Gannett, and they were paying the bills. The broadcast media were reporting the death, and the next day's newspapers would also do so. The Post, in fact, would banner it across page one, but since no one knew of the probe and Carr's links to it, the reportage would be superficial. For their part, the Gannett papers would deliberately play the story modestly. But the publishing dilemma would evaporate that same night, less than 24 hours after Carr's demise. When the issue dramatically decided itself, it is impossible to arrive at a reasonable conclusion as to what really happened to Michael Carr without considering his death in the context of what happened the next. Wheat Carr, in her own words, eloped with Yonkers policeman named John McCabe several months after the death of her brother John. McCabe spent October 4th in Manhattan, gathering Michael Carr's effects and identifying the body. That night, he phoned in sick for his scheduled midnight shift and substitute patrol. That night, he phoned in sick for his scheduled midnight shift, and a substituted patrolman, Carmine D'Ambrosio, took the wheel of McCabe's sector car. At 2 a.m., while driving McCabe's regular route on McCabe's scheduled shift and in McCabe's marked radio car, D'Ambrosio headed north on Warburton Avenue on a route that would take him below the darkened woodlands of Untermeyer Park, scene of noteworthy cult activity. At one point, the police car rounded a curve and drove down a straightaway. To Ambrosio's right, Untermeyer Park was a murky blur rising above him, but someone was lurking in the shadows. And then that someone blasted out the passenger side window of McCabe's sector car with a rifle shot fired broadside from some 20 yards inside the silent recesses of Untermeyer. The police car swerved and came to a screeching halt. D'Ambrosio wasn't hit, but the bullet which ultimately lodged in the molding of the driver's door barely missed him. Looking toward the sound, the officer saw an outline of a man disappearing into the woods and gave chase, firing 2 shots in the direction of the fleeing assailant. But Untermeyer Park swallowed up the gunman in its gloom. Yonkers police, responding immediately to the radio call, searched the area. The shooter was long gone, but they did find something else. There were cigarette butts and coffee containers near the spot where the gunman stood and waited until he could fire broadside into the passing police car. That McCabe was supposed to have been driving that vehicle has not been revealed until now. But this night wasn't over. It was destined to be a long one. At about this same time, 1,800 miles to the northwest in Minot, John Carr's friends Tom Taylor and Darlene Christensen, who had cooperated with the investigation, were driving home from a night out. It was approximately 1 a.m. on Country Road 12. Darlene was behind the wheel while Taylor dozed next to her in the passenger seat. Suddenly, a red Chevrolet Camaro appeared behind them, speeded up and forced them off the road and into a shallow ditch. Neither Taylor nor Christensen was hurt, and Darlene said the red Camaro kept right on going. Several days later, Taylor attempted suicide, overdosing on Quaaludes. He was comatose when Darlene found him in their spare apartment. Beside him was a note in which he apologized for his act and closed with the words, "Believe in God." But Taylor was still alive, and he was rushed to a local hospital. He survived. He was scared out of his wits, Gardner said. He knew more about what was going on than he ever told us. I don't think he was guilty of complicity, but I'm convinced he had some knowledge that frightened him. He had no more money, yet somehow came up with over $1,000 to fly to New York with Darlene for John Carr's funeral. He never gave a consistent answer as to why he went or where the money came from. I think he was a mule of some sort, taking something to New York, then or bringing something back without knowing what it was, but we can't prove it. Within months of the suicide attempt, Taylor and Christensen left Minot and didn't return. We ourselves had departed Minot on September 3rd, and in course of a 10-day span, beginning less than a month later, Gardner was shot at. Michael Carr died, his brother-in-law's sector car was shot up, and 2 friends of John Carr reported they were run off the road in Minot. That incident was followed by a suicide attempt with a curiously worded note considering the investigation's probe of Satanism. It was time to act. With input from Midigar, the editorial guidance from Bartley, Sherman Bodner, and Tom McNamara, the story was bannered across the Gannett, Westchester, Rockland papers, front pages on Friday, October 12th, which happened to have been John Carr's birthday. The headline read, NYC Police Reopens Son of Sam Probe. The byline was shared by myself, Midigar, and Jeff Neese. By arrangement, the Minot Daily News broke the story at the same time, and our bylines appeared there as well. To protect Sonoti, the lengthy article didn't mention that I'd been in Minot and used Ward County Sheriff Leon Schwan as the confirming source of the investigation. We and the City of Minot Police are assisting the investigation New York has begun. Schwan said, there are some things out here they're very interested in. With the non-expected demurral of the New York Daily News, the story received considerable attention. 4 days later was followed by another stating that John Carr was afraid a person from New York, Rockman, was out to kill him, and that Carr said if he'd remained in New York, Rockman was out to kill him, and that Rockman said he was out to kill him, and that Carr said if he'd remained in New York, the state would have fried me in an electric chair. Neither Rockman's name nor that of Darlene Christensen the source of the electric chair comment was published. Hints about suspected satanic cult activity appeared in both articles, but the evidence supporting a murder scenario in John Carr's death wasn't discussed. Michael Carr's connection also remained secret. The New York Post, as it is prone to do on occasion, rewrote our first story, got an additional quote from Gardner, and published it as if the information was its own. Reporter George Carpozzi's byline appeared on the article. In Attica Prison in upstate New York, David Berkowitz received a copy of the Post before the original story reached him, commenting on the allegations of Satanism. His relationship with John Carr and Carr's suspected complicity in the 44 case, Berkowitz wrote to a friend, "Everything is here. One neat package. Carpozzi had done it, but he doesn't realize it." Berkowitz went on to say the allegations were absolute facts. He also wrote that he knew John Carr had attended Minot State College. This was true, as he took some night courses there. Berkowitz even knew the name of the school. It was another confirmation of his association with John Carr. The New York City Police Department, caught with its hands in the proverbial cookie jar, was suddenly thrust into the limelight as conducting a new investigation of the biggest case, the case on which it slammed the door 2 years earlier. Captain Plankster had by this time sent 2 comprehensive reports on the probe to Deputy Chief Draher since August 31st, and Draher had forwarded them to Chief of Detectives James Sullivan. On October 17th, according to Plankster's next report, dated the 18th, Detective Hank Sinodi was at Draher's request asked to reveal how he first learned of Rockman and Rockman's acquaintances with John Carr. Plankster convened that information to Draher and wrote that Sinodi contacted police officials in Minot, ND, North Dakota, and discovered that the name of Rockman had appeared in police records during the investigation of the death of John Carr. It was at this time, August 10th, that Detective Sinodi approached the undersigned for the purpose of conducting an investigation. While Sinodi's rendering of the scenario to Plankster was true, he omitted 2 points. He didn't reveal Lucan's name and still protected in print. He didn't say that he first learned of Carr's involvement with Berkowitz and allegedly with Rockman from me. While the NYPD was bobbing and weaving from the press on October 17th, Queens District Attorney John Santucci sat with a number of Gannett newspaper articles on his desk. The dark-haired 48-year-old prosecutor began his career as an assistant in the very office he now headed. He was later a member of New York City's council and state senator before assuming the district attorney's chair on January 1st, 1977. There were more than 100 assistant prosecutors and a large number of other employees reporting to him. 5 Son of Sam attacks occurred in Santucci's jurisdiction as compared to 2 in the Bronx and 1 in Brooklyn, and he pursued the conspiracy articles with considerable interest, as he'd done since the first one appeared in March. Santucci had never been comfortable with the original resolutions of the 44 case. After hearing of Berkowitz's arrest, he and his close aide and press spokesman, Thomas McCarthy, were driven to one police plaza in a hair-raising ride on the potholed Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. While at Police Plaza, Santucci sat in on some of the questioning of Berkowitz and formed an opinion that Berkowitz was lucid and not demon-possessed, as he then claimed, and that the 44 case might well go deeper than it was presented to be. His own evaluation of the evidence left him with nagging doubts concerning Berkowitz's alleged sole responsibility. Santucci then pressed for a Berkowitz trial, but was persuaded by Eugene Gold in Brooklyn and the Bronx's Mario Merola to allow Berkowitz to plead guilty without any dissidence. Santucci's reluctance to yield to the pressure reached the media, where he was criticized by sources for his stance. But for the past week, since John Carr, NYPD Reopens article appeared, Santucci's office had been quietly compiling data about the case. After the story was published, some people called us with information. Others contacted the police or Santucci's office. In details in our newspaper reports, but rest by other data he accumulated that week, convinced Santucci that the nearly 2 million residents of his borough would be best served if he, as its top law enforcement official, probed further into the Berkowitz matter. From his own contacts, WPIX TV reporter Jeff Kamen caught the wind of Santucci's activities. WPIX Channel 11 in New York was also the flagship station for INN, the independent news, which reached a considerable number of U.S. markets. Ironically, WPIX and the Daily News were owned by the same parent company, and WPIX was even headquartered in the large Daily News building in Midtown Manhattan. But regarding the 44 conspiracy, the attitudes of the two media outlets were as divergent as night and day. While the Daily News had all but ignored the story and would continue to do so, WPIX TV had followed our investigation in Westchester. Since the Moskowitz article was published in mid-July, Kamen, an aggressive quality reporter, was denied access to Eugene's Gold office while trying to follow up on that investigative report. The lockout filmed and reported on the station's news broadcast. In the late afternoon of Wednesday, October 17th, Jeff Kamen called Santucci's press spokesman, Tom McCarthy. Kamen told McCarthy he heard Santucci reopened the Son of Sam case. "What kind of funny cigarettes are you smoking, Jeff?" McCarthy asked. "The Son of Sam case, you must be hallucinating." Kamen was insistent, and McCarthy, who planned to watch a World Series game that night, wanted to go home, but he agreed to walk down the hall to ask Santucci about it. "You better sit down, Tom," the DA said, "and I don't think you'll be seeing the ball game tonight." As McCarthy later explained, "In this office, I am sometimes deliberately in the dark on sensitive cases, and none was and is more sensitive than Son of Sam. This practice is in effect for two reasons. First, I don't want to be put in the position of having to deceive the press to protect matters of extreme confidentiality. And secondly, if I'm not familiar with certain details, I can't inadvertently let them slip out in conversations with journalists. That's why I didn't know what was happening to that point." But from that moment on, McCarthy knew much of what was to know. But from that moment on, McCarthy knew much of what there was to know about the 44 investigation. We were about to begin receiving a deluge of calls from reporters all over the country. It would be an ongoing thing. Some offered tips they heard or other information they thought might be helpful. Because of the scope of it all, I had to learn the case well in order to evaluate the information as it poured in from the press before passing it on. At home in White Plains that evening, I received a call from WPIX's Monica Rosenchim, with whom I'd spoken the week before about the NYPD story. "John Santucci is reopening the Son of Sam case. Now you've got him and the police department in on it. They've confirmed off the record we're breaking it tonight. We knew you'd want to know so you could get it in the morning's edition." To say I was overjoyed would be an understatement. Monica pledged me to secrecy and hung up. I called the Gannett office and said I'd be in to write the story. 5 minutes later, Nasa Moskowitz, mother of Stacy, was on the line. She'd been a frequent caller and supporter since March, and we'd spoken several times during the previous week. Steve Dunleavy just called me, she said. He wants to know if you heard anything about Santucci reopening the case. He said he heard a rumor about it. Why doesn't Steve call me himself? I think he feels you might be annoyed that the Post redid your story. No, but they might have given it a one-line credit, actually. I'm glad they ran it. This message has to get out. Steve says he was involved with you on the John Carr thing at the beginning. That he was. But things got screwed up. I've got a three-way gizmo here, Nessa said. Why don't we set up a conference call? A few minutes later, I heard Dunleavy's unmistakable accent. How's it going, mate? Long time no talk. I see you've been busy. Yeah, and I see you guys have been reading. Ask him about Santucci, Steve. Nessa cut in. We got a rumor today, but no one can flesh it out yet. You've been close to this. Did you hear anything? I couldn't violate Monaco's confidence, but I didn't want to deceive Dunleavy either. He would, after all, read the morning issue of today and immediately know if I misled him. Well, I heard that rumor too. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something to it, but who knows, I said. I was also dying to tell Dunleavy that his old nemesis, Verona Lucan, had provided information that was part of the NYPD's probe but resisted the temptation. So you heard it too, Dunleavy said. I'm going to call their night number over there, the hotline, and see what we can get. I'll get back to you. In a few minutes, the phone rang again. They're reopening too, Dunleavy gushed. It's going to be a circus now. They're confirming off the record. If we go with it, they won't deny it, but they're not making formal statements. See you on the front page tomorrow, Steve, I remarked, and we said goodbye. It was going to be a busy night for both of us. I called Jim Midigar and told him I was driving to the paper to write the story. Jim volunteered to phone Queens to learn anything else he could. At Gannett's offices, I wrote the article and phoned Jeff Neese in Minot so he'd have the wording too. The papers were cooperating all the way on this case. What Neese didn't know was that some of Carr's friends who saw him at the interviews thought he was an undercover narcotics cop posing as a reporter. Gardner was somewhat concerned of Neese's safety, but didn't tell him so as not to rattle him unnecessarily. Midigar then called from his Staten Island home to say he'd received the confirmation from McCarthy, too. He said it was a serious matter and they don't want to exploit the case. They were attempting to do this quietly, but it leaked. So it had to, eventually. We print and they won't deny. At 10 p.m., with several other staffers and the article's editors Alex Poltetsky and Tom McNamara, I took time out to watch Channel 11's news broadcast. A muffled cheer went up from the ground gathered in a small TV. A muffled cheer went up from the group gathered at the small TV in the newsroom as the story WPIX's lead item was aired. The Gannett papers had themselves walked a precarious limb. They touched the untouchable Son of Sam case, and now, along with the earlier news of the NYPD's probe, they were vindicated. I wonder if Eugene Gold is watching this, McNamara exclaimed. He thought he'd make fools of us in July. Let him absorb this for a while. Santucci had 5 shootings out there, and he's in our corner. There was never a doubt, I deadpanned. All we needed was a little time to pull it all together. Although I tried to maintain a stoic posture, my emotions were strong. As I watched WPIX and heard the words, "The Queens District Attorney's Office has reopened the Son of Sam case," I shook hands with the others and said a quiet thank God. The job was done. More than 2 years of work, of constant challenge and occasional derision and ridicule, had finally paid off in one of the biggest and most notorious criminal cases in U.S. history. At last, the unmovable mountain had been shaken. Like Tom McNamara, I too thought of Brooklyn DA Eugene Gold, of the many of the many others who tried to block the investigation and disclosures. Gold had publicly charged me with wild speculation in my reporting. With Jim of the Moskowitz scenario, Gannett took it on the chin with that one too, but we kept going. The press dogs had finally had their day. The Associated Press and United Press International monitored the WPIX broadcast. Their reports were on the wires in short order and were promptly picked up by other TV and radio outlets. But no other New York newspapers got the word in time of their deadlines, so it was Gannett and the Post which scooped the print media the next morning. The Gannett headline, which etched across the front page in large type, said, "Queens DA enters Son of Sam probe." Jim and I shared the byline. The article stated that Santucci was adding his own resources to those of the NYPD and summed up earlier information. The Post's front page blared, "Son of Sam shocker. Queens DA reopens the case." The next day, the New York Times reported the investigation in a detailed article by police reporter Len Butter, and other area papers highlighted the story. However, the Daily News carried but a brief item on an inside page. The NYPD was caught off guard by Santucci's action, and Deputy Chief Dreyer and Chief of Detectives Sullivan were less than delighted to learn that a DA was now involved. There was embarrassment aplenty. First, the top-secret investigation went public, and now Santucci was poking around too. After 5 p.m. on October 19th, Jane Jacqueline's husband, a now rehired NYPD uniformed officer, was interviewed by Dreher, Inspector Charles Rourke, and Captain John Plankster at the 48th Precinct in the Bronx. Jane Jacqueline was supposed to have approached Veronica Lucan about Rockman and then later to have been cut up and thrown into Little Neck Bay. I had already determined that the woman who allegedly talked to Lucan was not the real Jane Jacqueline, whom Midigar and I met in early 1978. According to Plankster's report dated October 22nd, when John Jacqueline was asked if he knew anyone by the name of Rockman, there was an apparent nervous reaction, but he stated he did not know anybody by that name. He was presented with a photo of Rockman and first stated it resembled someone he knew a long time ago who was involved with drugs. He then stated it might resemble a reporter who had questioned his wife regarding the Son of Sam killings. He indicated that several reporters had questioned his wife regarding her connections with a group of people who were allegedly associated with Berkowitz. Jacqueline then called Jane. Jane states she was interviewed by a Maury Terry and a man named Midigar who represented themselves as reporters and asked if she ever used drugs, ever visited the Blue Dolphin Diner, or if she knew Reeve Rockman. They also asked if she knew Veronica Lucan and showed a letter allegedly written by Lucan which described how Jane's body was cut up and thrown into Little Neck Bay. The interviews of Jane and John Jacqueline led to the presumption that Veronica Lucan is the informant referred to in Detective Sinodi's original report, and is the individual who allegedly observed Berkowitz and Rockman together in Jacqueline's auto. Veronica Lucan is known to this department because of her unorthodox religious practices in Queens. Her reliability as a witness or informant is seriously in question, and that possibility of independently establishing an association between Rockman and Berkowitz in Queens County during 1977 is doubtful. This is all the top brass in the NYPD needed to hear. Lucan was bonkers, and this embarrassing investigation could be closed down immediately. Santucci could twist in the wind by himself, but Plankster didn't agree. Despite this reversal, we have developed information and circumstances that almost demand resolution. I believed that this investigation should be continued, if only for the sake of being able to say that this department has never ignored or overlooked any information connected with the Son of Sam shootings. Some of the questions and information generated by this investigation are listed below. A. We have statements that John Carr knew Berkowitz from Minot. B. We have statements that John Carr mentioned Berkowitz and Son of Sam before Berkowitz's arrest. C. We have statements that Rockman was an associate of John Carr. D. We have statements that Rockman was involved in witchcraft. E. The Berkowitz letters and writings seem to contain references to witchcraft. F. We have a statement that John Carr knew some of the victims. This may have been so despite the fact that the original informant turned out to be unreliable. G. Rockman lived near two of the shootings in Forest Hills and worked in the same building as one of the victims. H. The second Forest Hills shooting, Virginia Vaquerichanes, is not consistent with the other shootings in terms of time and type of location. Rockman was interviewed by Dreher, Plankster, and Rourke in a few days later. Not surprisingly, denied everything. However, Plankster still wasn't satisfied, but was overruled. The NYPD dropped out of the probe after 2 months and prepared to bring up Sinodi on a smattering of charges related to his failure to identify and produce Lucan and his traveling to Minot with me. He would also be charged with providing me with confidential information. The fact I uncovered the John Carr Rockman information first and lined up the interviews, and that Sinodi joined me in Minot, not the other way around, was irrelevant to Dreher and Chief of Detectives James Sullivan. They were out to portray Sinodi as a rogue, unbalanced cop with an unreliable informant, Lucan. It was their way out of a situation they never wanted to reach the public in the first place, and they'd see to it that Santucci received little cooperation either. This same night, October 22nd, retired homicide detective John Basteri called me. For years, Basteri had been friendly with NYPD Lieutenant Remo Francini, who currently was in charge of the squad of NYPD detectives assigned to Santucci's office. These detectives assisted the district attorney's investigations, but reported through the NYPD chain of command, not directly to the DA. This structuring would soon acquire a special significance. Santucci also had a contingent of Queens County detectives who did report directly to him. Francini advised Basteri that Sinodi had just been suspended by the police department. He added that Santucci sent Homicide Bureau Chief Herb Leifer and Queens County Detective George Bird to interview Sinodi at the 48th Precinct. While there, Dreher refused to allow the Queens representative to question Sinodi. Francini asked Basteri to locate Sinodi since Santucci wanted to speak with him immediately. Man, a lot of Italians here. I told Basteri I'd try to track down the elusive Henry Sinodi, and within an hour I got word to him. They sent me to a department shrink, Hank said, and he asks me why don't I give up the name of my informant. Some shrink. I see what's going on. They're going to try to destroy me. I'm not suspended, but I am on modified assignment. Desk duty, no gun, psychiatric evaluation. I saw that Leifer at the 4-8. I was there, but he wasn't allowed to see me. Santucci's people want to talk to you, I said. They asked to see me, too. Joe is going out with me Wednesday, the 24th. Why don't you show up yourself? I don't know, Hank said. I gotta think about it. If I see you, I see you. But don't approach me. I can't be seen with you. Sinodi turned down my offer to speak with Plankster about the genesis of the Minot trip, and my conclusion that Lucan had spoken with a Jane Jacqueline imposter. I also told Hank that Michael and John Carr and the cult were getting lost in the shuffle. They could care less, Sonotti said, and if you go to them with it only makes my situation worse. If I couldn't help the beleaguered detective directly, there were other things I could do. It was time to publish the Untermeyer Park's cult connection to the Son of Sam letters. I worked that night and the next on the story, consulting frequently with Jim Midigar. Jack Graham of the Minot Daily News located a Michigan college professor who was an occult expert, and he was interviewed for by the article. Located a Michigan college professor who was an occult expert, and he was interviewed for the article. Requesting anonymity because of his job, the academic said he believed the Son of Sam symbol was borrowed from the original Eliphas Levi, rendering that the German shepherd ears were a unique emblem. He added something that would soon cause a bit of a stir. I believe you are dealing with a sadomasochistic group with strong undertones of latent homosexuality. This is an evil group that turned to ritualistic killing, using the occult as an excuse for their own latent homosexuality. Fucking homos. They borrowed from Satanism, from magic, and from whatever they saw and liked. The story was ready to go and would appear on Wednesday, October 24th. In the newsroom the night before, I got the opportunity to return Monica Rosenschim's recent favor. I called WPIX, and speaking alternately with her and another WPIX employee, Felix Martinez, filled them in on what we were publishing in the morning. The Gannett editors approved the arrangement since WPIX consented to credit us with breaking the story. Our discussions with Channel 11 ended not 5 minutes before airtime, and once again we surrounded the TV to watch the broadcast. WPIX was true to its word, and the cult story led off the newscast. On the 24th, the article itself hit the newsstands under the front page headline Satanic Cult Tied to Sam Killings. A large photo of the so-called Devil's Cave accompanied the piece. Channel 11 and others sent camera crews to Untermeyer Park to film follow-ups for the nightly TV news. I was asked to meet the WPIX crew at Untermeyer, but was forced to demur. I was due at the district attorney's office in Queens. As Joe Basteri and I approached the Queens County office complex, we spied Hank Sonotti entering a side door. He ignored us and went to speak with Herb Leifer, the Homicide Bureau chief. Meanwhile, Basteri and I talked with Lieutenant Romero Francini and Tom McCarthy until Leifer and George Bird arrived. Santucci was about to dispatch Assistant District Attorney Michael Artementi, the county detective Tom Muldridge, and to Minot, and his staff wanted to learn about our trip. Yes, I was there, I said, and I didn't try to hide the fact from anyone in Minot, just the NYPD to protect Sonotti. He didn't leak a thing to me. It was the other way around. I briefed the DA's staff on the findings thus far and agreed to cooperate with their investigation. We all want the same thing within reason. I'll do what I can, but certain sources will have to be protected. Leifer didn't go for that idea, but McCarthy, a press liaison, explained my position. Leifer still wasn't pleased, but nodded his reluctant assent. While there, I learned that Santucci had tried to question Berkowitz, but the confessed Son of Sam sent back a message saying he wouldn't cooperate with the DA's new probe. That says something, doesn't it? I asked. If it was nonsense, he'd be the first one to stand up and take sole credit again. I wrote the story of Berkowitz's refusal to cooperate 2 days later. The makings of another uneasy situation with Midigar were hatched that day, as the DA's representatives said they couldn't deal with him because of his imminent trial. We're not passing judgment. It just wouldn't be appropriate for us under the circumstances, one said. Midigar said he understood the decision, but was nonetheless unhappy about it. He was isolated from the Minot officials, and now the Queen's DA placed him on a shelf as well. It's becoming your case, he told me. I understand why, and you're the one who had John Carr, Moskowitz, and the cult in the first place. I'm 40 miles away out here, and I'm going on trial, so work with Queens as you see fit. Jim's byline continued to appear on every story we published during the next several months, and his input was helpful, but he and the case were divorcing, mostly due to circumstances and bad timing. As for Santucci, his office would soon need all the cooperation it could muster. The DA endured a lot of official heat for reopening the Son of Sam case. Eugene Gold lined up against him, and the NYPD was incensed that he dared to challenge its position. Sergeant Joe Coffey, for example, had been a supervisor on the Omega Task Force. He walked into Santucci's office and pointedly told him, "You're not going to get a thing." He bet Santucci a dinner that the inquiry would fail and stalked out of the room. Coffey knew that the deck was being stacked. The New York City Police Department withdrew its support and refused to cooperate with Santucci's probe. Because of this major rift, the DA decided not to utilize his own squad of NYPD detectives in the 44 investigation so as not to compromise their standing in the police department. He would instead conduct the inquiry with his assistant district attorneys and county detectives. There were numerous NYPD detectives who disagreed with the department's position. Some quietly assisted the investigation anyway, and worked clandestinely with me, if not the DA, over the years. But the department's official posture, cast in concrete by those at the top, was that Berkowitz committed all the 44 shootings by himself. There was to be a precarious little middle ground on this case. One was either a friend or foe. Reporter Howard Blum of the New York Times and others called to warn me about the deputy chief Edwin Dreher was waging a smear campaign against me in Sonoti. It's pretty pathetic, Blum said. From the story I heard, Sonoti is supposed to be an insane religious fanatic and a homosexual Nazi, and you and Sonoti are supposed to be homosexual lovers. That son of a bitch, I said. He can't shoot down the case, so he rises this crap. A deputy chief of the NYPD, maybe my fiancé would be interested in hearing that I'm a fag. I was soon to be married to Georgiana, the woman I talked with at the Sirani Esau murder scene in April 1978. He's hurting the police department's position in himself, not you, Blum said. Nobody believes him. They're appalled. I just wanted you to know. Dreher didn't stop. In March 1981, WOR-TV aired the first of several syndicated television specials about the case. I served as reporter and host for the segments. Dreher, reading that the initial report was due to air, asked for a preview. According to the executive producer for the news magazine series What's Happening America, Dreher previewed the show and obviously didn't like what he was seeing. As soon as it was over, he started calling you a fag and Sonoti's lover. And he said Sonoti was insane and a neo-Nazi. We told him to screw off, the producer said. He was trying to get us to kill the show. That time, I didn't ignore Dreher. I immediately called the NYPD's Deputy Commissioner for Public Information and told her that if Dreher persisted with his slurs, I was going to file a written complaint against him, whether Dreher stopped his attacks or not. I don't know, but I heard nothing more about him from reporters after that incident. Using that approach to attempt to discredit me and others to impede John Santucci's office, the NYPD brass rolled through the Son of Sam case. Mayor Ed Koch, who would sleep through more corruption scandals than Rip Van Winkle, blissfully ignored the turmoil. Throughout the probe, I appeared on a number of radio and TV programs. On several occasions, NYPD officials were invited to debate the case with me. Each time the department declined the offers. It seemed as if the power elite was more comfortable with whispered slander than public discussion, which in itself says something. The Queen's investigation built momentum despite the police department's maneuverings. Detectives delved deeply into Berkowitz's life and interviewed friends and members of his family. And the original Minot informants were questioned again by Michael Armoretti and Tom Muldridge. Other investigators talked to the Casadas and Carr's former police auxiliary associates of Berkowitz, surviving Son of Sam victims in Queens, and numerous others. Herb Leifer and Detective George Bird spent considerable time in Yonkers, and piles of Yonkers Police Department reports and those of the NYPD were scrutinized. Investigators even crossed jurisdictional boundaries when they questioned star Brooklyn witness Cecilia Davis in depth. Mrs. Davis simply retold the story as I'd already published it. She was on target as far as we're concerned, Leifer reported. Santucci said, "It's apparent Berkowitz wasn't alone that night in Brooklyn. The investigators also sought out photos of John Carr as Leifer and Bird left Wheat Carr's new residence in Hastings on Hudson. She called out to them, 'You want to know what John Carr looked like?' Bird and Leifer turned around, and Wheat grabbed her shoulder-length hair and pulled it tightly above her neck. 'Here's what he looked like,' she yelled to startle the investigators. As detectives also acquired data on 44 purchases and other aspects of the case from Texas, Florida, New Jersey, and California. Bit by bit, the picture was developed. A group picture. In it were Berkowitz and some accomplices. At one point, Santucci observed, 'Whoever said Berkowitz was a friendless loner was dead wrong. This guy had a lot of contacts and connections.' The Queen's probers also looked into the Reeve Rockman matter. The assessment, independent of my own, was that while Rockman was identified in North Dakota, corroboration beyond that provided by Veronica Lukin was necessary in New York. Until then, Rockman was guilty of association with John Carr, and perhaps Berkowitz directly responsible for the 44 killings. Lukin, whose story was supported by her husband, said she had 3 informants who alleged Rockman was involved in satanic cult activity. One of those was the Jane Jacqueline imposter. Of the others, Nikki had disappeared in Haiti, and Wendy Smith, whose last name was a common one, proved extremely difficult to track down. Linda O'Connor in North Dakota said that Michael Carr received drug therapy at a large rehabilitation center in New York, a location where, curiously enough, Rockman was once employed as an accountant. But investigators weren't able to confirm Michael Carr's presence there, at least not under his real name. So the Rockman connection was put on the back burner. In Westchester, our own probe continued. Sometimes the path crossed that of the DA's investigators. We continued publishing the results throughout the remainder of 1979 into the mid-1980s. Or 1979 and into the mid-1980. Damn. Jesus, well, I just keep adding words, don't I? We continued publishing the result throughout the remainder of 1979 and into mid-1980. The public was supportive, and numerous tips were phoned to Gannett and the district attorney's office. Some people, wanting to ensure that their leads weren't bypassed, forwarded them to both places. Members of the press offered information to Santucci's staff. An example of a variable lead given both to me and to Santucci was one which originated with two members of a sheet metal workers union to which Berkowitz belonged in late 1976 and early 1977, before he joined the Postal Service. These sources said that Berkowitz showed a .38 caliber revolver to several co-workers while in an apprentice class in Westchester. At the same time, they reported that Berkowitz was very friendly with a young man named Phil Kahn, and that Berkowitz and Kahn left the job one day in January 1977, telling co-workers they were driving to an animal shelter to adopt a German Shepherd. No, a .38 revolver was found. No, or number. Either way. No .38 revolver was found in Berkowitz's apartment, but that information insisted he possessed it at the time. As for Kahn, he admitted his friendship with Berkowitz to the Queen's probers, but denied the German Shepherd excursion. Again, his fellow workers reported Kahn was lying. Kahn remains under scrutiny. In time, a list of suspects, including Kahn, emerged. Among the others were ex-Yonkers police officer Peter Shane and Howard Weiss, Berkowitz connection. Oh, crap. In time, a list of suspects, including Kahn, emerged. Among others were ex-Yonkers police officers Peter Shane of the Howard Weiss Berkowitz connection, Weiss himself, Michael and John Carr, and Bobby, the man who was ejected from one Candlelight Inn with Berkowitz and Michael Carr. There were other candidates too. As for the 44 shootings themselves, my own evaluation at the time was that Berkowitz most likely pulled the trigger in the attacks on Donna and Loria and Jody Valente and on Valentina Serrani and Alexander Esau. These shootings accounted for 3 murders and 1 wounding in the Bronx. Midigar and I were convinced he didn't shoot Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante in Brooklyn, Joanne Lomino and Donna DeMasi in Queens or Virginia, Valkyrie Chain in Queens. 3 attacks remained questionable. The murder of Christine Freund, Eliphas woundings of Judy Placido, and Sal Lupo, and the wounding of Carl DeNaro. We believed that Berkowitz probably didn't shoot DeNaro because of the assailant's obvious difficulty controlling the weapon, and because 3 shell casings reportedly were found at the scene. The .44 revolver doesn't eject shells, and no casings were found at any other sites. This too suggested a different shooter and a weapon other than Berkowitz's bulldog, but at no incident did we think the shooter acted without support of some type. In early November, another cult-related incident occurred near Untermeyer Park in Yonkers. This time, the witness was Westchester County police officer who stumbled into a ritual being held at the old Stillwell estate on North Broadway, barely a half a mile from Untermeyer. The sheriff's department tried to keep the incident from reaching the public, but Gannett reporter Ed Trapasso uncovered the details anyway. The estate was county property, and at dusk on Saturday, November 10th, the officer walked through the woods and saw a group of at least 5 people standing in a circle. One man dressed in a red cape, The one man dressed in a red cape was leading the others in a series of chants. The caped high priest was also holding 2 German shepherds on chains. Seeing the cop, the group scattered and escaped. Subsequent investigation by the police revealed satanic writings on the interior walls of a decaying carriage house nearby. The phrases said, "Demon, welcome to hell," and "entering hell." The red cape, I told Trapasso, likely indicated that the group was engaged in a fertility or sex magic ritual at the time. Sheriff's officials blustered that there was no evidence linking the ritual to the Son of Sam cult meetings up the block at Untermeyer. Apparently, North Broadway was becoming Satan Street, USA. They have no evidence to say it wasn't connected either. I told Trapasso, these are the people who 86 reports and don't know how to investigate a return address on a threatening letter. They called it doublespeak in the Watergate days, Trapasso joked. Our own evaluation was that with the German shepherds in tow and with the incident occurring so proximate to Untermeyer, it was indeed possible the ceremony was linked to the 44 case. While the work progressed in Queens and Westchester, someone was watching from a distance, reading the Gannett reports and those written by the AP and the Post. David Berkowitz, incarcerated in Attica Prison near upstate Buffalo, had refused to help Santucci, but that didn't mean he was staying out of the fray. Berkowitz had been wrestling with his conscience since we met at Marcy a year before. He decided the time had come. He was going to aid the investigation, but he was going to do it his way, not the way of John Santucci. An incredible behind-the-scenes drama was about to unfold. Its opening act would stretch the Son of Sam conspiracy from coast to coast. Bit of a long one today, my goodness.